I'm Karen Lips, president of the Network of Enlightened Women. New works to empower young women to be principled leaders for a free society. Today, I'm joined by Congresswoman Ashley Hinson, who represents Iowa's 1st Congressional District. Previously, she served in the Iowa State House and worked as a local news reporter in Cedar Rapids. During her time as a reporter, she earned recognition as a 2-time Midwest Regional Emmy Award winner. She graduated from the University of Southern California and is the mom of 2 boys. Thank you so much for joining us today, Congresswoman.
Thanks for having me, Karen. Good to be with you.
Yes, I'm excited to hear more about your career in journalism and talk about the state of journalism today.
Yeah.
Could you talk about how you transitioned from journalism to running for office and what really made you decide to make that jump to run?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting, Karen, because there's no manual for stepping up to run for office, right? It's just kind of, you want to add your voice to the conversation and you figure it out as you go. And that's kind of how my path has gone. But I spent about 11 years on the air doing morning TV, morning and midday news. So I anchored the morning show and reported as well. And was one of those people who was on the steps of the state capitol covering state policy, interviewing those policymakers. So I really had a chance to see what really worked for public policy, also what didn't, because if it didn't, usually it was making news, and cover those stories for years. I also got to see, in 2008, we had some major flooding in Cedar Rapids and throughout eastern Iowa, and I got to cover that devastating flooding, but I also got to cover the recovery process. And I saw a lot of our legislators really working together, which was inspiring to me. And then follow that up with a major budget crisis under Democrat management, Democrat House and Democrat governor, Democrat Senate. They had to do an across the board 10% cut because they didn't respect taxpayers. So that for me, as someone who was getting out of bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, not making a huge amount of money, I was really angry about that as a taxpayer. And that kind of got me thinking about how I could add my voice to the conversation. So then when the opportunity presented itself in 2015 to step up and run for the state house, my husband and I had that conversation because I did have to leave my career in the media to run. You can't be on the air and be a political candidate at the same time, because obviously I still valued objectivity in the media and was really, really passionate about making sure that was still a major part of how I did my job. So left the news business and ran for state house, and the rest is history. 4 years there, and now I'm here in Congress.
So do you find that some of the skills you learned in journalism, some of the investigation, figuring out how to tell a story, do those translate into Congress and help you to become a better Congresswoman?
Absolutely. I think being a good communicator is what this job is all about, not only in the halls of Congress, but back home. I think what's been missing a lot of times from, the policymaking discussion is context, giving context as to why. Let me tell you, there's a lot of things in DC I ask, why is this happening? But if I can go home and it's something that I support or am against and I give the appropriate context, I think that's where being a journalist in the past has really helped me to be a better advocate for my constituents and also communicate to them, again, the context about what's happening here. I see a lot of synergies between being a journalist and being a legislator. Instead of putting a story on the air, you're putting together a bill. You're still talking to sources. You're still talking to stakeholders, constituents who this policy affects, and you're gathering their stories and their perspectives and using that to influence the legislation that you work on. So a lot of crossover there, and I think it's been very, very helpful to me to have that experience in the work that I'm doing here.
Well, I'm excited to ask you now about just the state of journalism overall. I mean, you're one of the few people who's gone from journalist to congresswoman. What do we need to do to fix the state of media and journalism today?
Yeah, and it's a huge challenge. And I think, we talk a lot about accountability and transparency and how important that is. You have to start holding people accountable if you believe them to be biased. I think people should be honest about their biases. And if that's the case, then we need to have a shift in what's considered a trusted journalism source versus trusted opinion source. And I think that, the people who are, the pundits, obviously pundits are very out there with their opinions. People who are journalists who are really pundits should be honest about their biases. I think that's really what's wrong with journalism right now. And I think some of that comes down to training. I was trained really in the old school journalism. You have your sources, you present both sides of the issue, And you don't slant your coverage, right? You let your people who are watching decide what their opinion is on something. And I think we need to get back to that good old fashioned journalism. Some of that starts in the classrooms at our colleges and universities also, which is another place that I think we can really be good stewards with our education in terms of training the next batch of journalists. But part of it, you just got to hold people accountable. Letters to the editor when you need to call out papers for being too liberal and only presenting one kind of viewpoint. I think that's really important. And then letters to the editor to support people you believe in too, because ultimately I'm about balance, and I think it's important to know what the other side is thinking, feeling, and how policy that I support impacts them if they don't agree with me. And I think that's just a really important part of what we're doing here in Washington, D.C. also. But yeah, I know that the media is typically not on our side, but that's also why I've tried to make sure that I am being very transparent and open with the media. I want to make sure that they understand what I'm working on and why, what I was talking earlier about, making sure that I'm providing that context. So I do a weekly press call every Friday to make sure that our local media has a good relationship with me and good access, because I think that's another part of the equation. Not shutting them out makes them not an adversary as much.
Well, that's interesting. Making sure you've got that transparency and that openness with the media maybe leads to some more trust, hopefully, and they'd come to you instead of just going with maybe a rumor or something else that's out there. And that's what we want, right? Is making sure that they go to the actual sources and get the facts. And I was wondering, do you feel like as a conservative woman, you are covered any differently in the media? As an organization for conservative young women, we often feel like conservative women maybe don't always get the same treatment as liberal women by the media. And I wondered if you face that and if you have any advice for our young women.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a double standard when it comes to conservative women. And I do think it's unfair. Women get asked questions that men don't get asked in general in politics. And I think that it's my job to push back against those, I guess you call them stereotypes and preconceived notions, and try to make sure that I'm just operating differently. So
did you face any of those on the campaign trail?
Well, and I think some of them had to do with being a mom, to be honest. Like, people were very concerned about me being a working mom in Congress, traveling a lot, having kids, same with the State House. And I basically push back against that notion. I say, look, number one, a lot of people travel for work, maybe more so before the pandemic, but there are a lot of working parents who travel. They make it work for their families. Also, would you be asking my husband the same question if he was the one running? And the answer is usually no, right? I mean, so I've been able to make it work very effectively out here. I actually have my son with me. I've had both sons out with me this summer for a week. So they get a full Camp Congress experience is what I would like to say. But I'm still able to be, I was at every single basketball game this spring. I made it home and made that a priority. So like any parent, I'm going to make sure that I'm prioritizing my family and my kids. But I think this job is really important and I'm doing it for them.
And you've now been in the job a little over a half a year. Could you talk about what your biggest accomplishment is so far?
Gosh, well, I think the best thing our office has done is really standing up for taxpayers. When I came here, I knew that was my number one job. And whether or not it's, helping them constituents navigate through the IRS, Social Security, all of those issues that they're facing that make their lives harder. I think a lot of our biggest accomplishments are really helping our constituents navigate those challenges. Legislatively, I've put forth several pieces of legislation, but I think we applied a lot of pressure when it came to trying to encourage the Biden administration to acknowledge the crisis at the border. I was very strong on that from the beginning because I believe in safety and security for Iowa families and for American families. And so when I looked at the crisis at the border, the hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants crossing the border, the dangerous drugs, the cartels are doing a really brisk business under the Biden administration. And so I introduced a piece of legislation called the See the Crisis Act, which would have defunded Air Force Two for any travel until Vice President Harris went to go see the border. And what that really did was, since I had seen the border, it drew attention to the fact that she hadn't. They were turning a blind eye to the crisis. And so we were able to continue to put pressure on the administration. They still haven't really taken any action on that, but we did get Vice President Harris to go to Texas and at least take a listen to some of the things that were happening there. But this is a crisis that's now clearly impacting all of our states and all of our communities. Every state's a border state in dealing with the crisis at the border. So I'm proud of that work to hold the administration accountable, because ultimately Congress has three main jobs: to make sure we're authorizing programs, overseeing those programs, and funding them. And typically Congress fails at least 2 out of 3 of those.
Yeah, it's too bad. It's easy for, I think, some of the elected officials to get focused on other things instead of the main priorities. And I want to go back. You mentioned running for office and motherhood, which is a topic that a lot of our members care a lot about. Could you talk about what you've done in Congress to address women in this country? I know the Biden administration came out with its plan and put that really at the forefront. Could you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that and what you've been advocating for in Congress?
Yep, absolutely. I think it's crucial that we stand up for women in Congress. Our voice matters, and we bring a lot of really good insight to this conversation. Specifically, as a working parent, I understand how important childcare access is in rural America. It's been a struggle, and then you look at what happened during the pandemic. It's exponentially gotten more challenging and more expensive. So I've introduced a couple pieces of legislation. Number one, we need to gather effective data on how we're over-regulating these childcare centers around the country to the point where it's too expensive and not accessible. So I'm working on trying to find real data-driven solutions, which I think is oftentimes, again, not how business is done here. It's emotional legislating a lot of times. So I want to focus on the data and figure out how we can actually fix this problem around the country.
Could you go into that a little bit more? I think some of our viewers would be interested in that. Some of the regulations that are in place, for example, end up increasing the cost.
Yeah, so if we're regulating toys and what toys you can have in a daycare, for example, that's just going to add additional cost to what you're regulating, what 3-year-olds can play with. That's just one example of something egregious that we know is out there. Obviously, we want to make sure that regulations are actually based on safety. And so that is what the aim of that bill is designed to do, not focus on things that are maybe pie in the sky ideas that are just adding cost and burden on those small businesses. So that's what that bill aims to do. The other thing that I would like to highlight, I understand, having had 2 babies myself, access to good OB care and good maternal health care is crucial. We have several counties in my district in Iowa that are considered maternal health care deserts. So I'm working on and this is actually a bipartisan issue, which I think is even better. We should highlight the things that we're working on that are truly issues that affect all women in this country. So we've co-sponsored some legislation that will hopefully help with more birthing centers being opened around the center or around the country, so that women aren't having to drive 2 hours to have a baby someplace. Training.
What's preventing that now? Is it regulations, or do they have to get permits, or why do we need legislation for that?
There's a couple things. Well, I think specifically this is to just incentivize opening these centers in places, because rural healthcare in general has been a huge challenge. As you mentioned, the deserts, it's hard to get specialists to go to some of these places also. Not just in OB, but in other specialty areas as well. I was just talking to a group of orthopedic surgeons. People in rural Iowa still need their knees and shoulders and hips done. And we're starting to see more people take risks on going to rural America. But whatever we can do, especially when it comes to maternal health, we want healthy moms, we want healthy babies. And we want to encourage people to have families. As we're seeing a birth rate drop in Iowa, there was just a story, it's incredibly low right now. So we need to be encouraging people to have a healthy pregnancy. So that's what that bill aims to do. It aims to support birthing centers, and then again, more grants to hopefully train some more midwives, so we can incentivize providers, right? I mean, I mentioned access to providers is just a huge battle. Some of that is liability based. I did some work on medical malpractice reform in the state legislature, because ultimately, again, you talk about over-regulating and over-penalizing providers. They're just going to say, sorry, it's not worth me doing business here if it becomes cost prohibitive for them to do so. And they, obviously I know how important care is to these folks who are putting their experience on the line and coming to rural America to help people, which is what they want to do. So those are two. So the childcare side, and then supporting the making sure we're having healthy babies and healthy moms is the other side of what I've been working on.
Well, it sounds like you're working on a lot of different issues, which is wonderful because I think, we don't just have to focus as women on one issue or two issues. There's so many different issues to address.
Yeah.
Many of our students who are involved in new on campus or after college really want to be leaders both now and in the future. Could you talk about what leadership skills have been most important for you as you take on and tackle a lot of different issues?
Yeah. Well, communication, being able to ask questions and go on offense on issues, do your homework. I think that's absolutely crucial to being successful in any leadership role, no matter what level you're in. I think people often underestimate you as a woman. And if you do your homework and you over prepare, my grandfather used to say this, and I know many people have said this quote, but success favors the over prepared. And I've truly tried to operate that way. But over preparation combined with good communication skills, I think are two great leadership prep traits, I guess you'd say, to make sure that you're going to be successful. The other thing I would say, and it's true in so many areas, my husband's in sales, but if you don't ask, the answer is always no. Being willing to ask for help, being able to willing to ask for to have someone help you get someplace that you're interested in. Ask for a mentor. Making sure you're reaching out now to develop those relationships long term will help you to be successful, and then have a great network when you get someplace like being a member of Congress, for example, that you can go back to.
Well, I think that reaching out when you need that help is something that is sometimes hard for a lot of us, but is such an important skill. I want to end, Congresswoman, by asking you, in New, we talk a lot about putting forth an empowering vision for women in this country. And I'm wondering, do you consider yourself a feminist?
I would say that I support policies that support women. So I think I'm a woman who's fighting for Iowans, and there are a lot of women in Iowa. So Iowa, if you want to call it that, you can. But I think I fight for issues that are good for all of us, and if they're good for women, I think they're also good for all of us. So that's what I would say to that.
Well, I appreciate that unifying vision policy and trying to find solutions for all of us. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Carrie.